I died alone in a hospital room on the night of my sister's graduation party. The morphine drip had malfunctioned hours ago, and the pain in my chest, the same congenital heart condition my parents had dismissed as attention-seeking for years, felt like shattered glass grinding against my ribs. I'd pressed the call button 17 times. No one came. Through the thin hospital walls, I could hear laughter from the nurse's station, someone talking about weekend plans. My phone sat on the bedside table, the screen black and silent. No missed calls, no texts asking if I was okay. Because they were all at Emily's party. My parents, my aunts and uncles, my grandmother who'd promised she'd visit first thing in the morning. Even Dr. Chen, our family friend who'd finally agreed to look at my medical files after I'd collapsed at work, had left early to attend. "Your sister only graduates summa cum laude once," he'd said with an apologetic smile, adjusting his tie. "I'll check on you tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. Not for me. The last thing I remembered was the monitor's beeping growing erratic, my vision tunneling to a pinpoint of fluorescent light, and the overwhelming certainty that I had lived 26 years without ever mattering to anyone. Then, darkness, pressure, the sensation of being compressed into something impossibly small. And then I was 7 years old again, gasping awake in my childhood bedroom with tears streaming down my face and 19 years of memories that hadn't happened yet burning in my mind like acid. I knew immediately it wasn't a dream. The knowledge was too complete, too visceral. I could remember the exact shade of Emily's graduation dress, champagne silk with pearl buttons. I could remember my father's speech, how he'd called her our greatest achievement, while I'd been choking on my own failing heart 3 miles away. I could remember dying, and worse, I could remember that not one of them had felt guilty enough to visit my body before the cremation. They'd been too busy celebrating. That first morning, I'd run to my mother's room, ready to throw myself into her arms and sob out the nightmare of my future. I found her in front of her vanity, applying lipstick with the precision of someone preparing for battle. "Mommy," I'd whispered, my 7-year-old voice cracking. "I had a bad dream." She hadn't even turned around. "Claire, I'm busy. Emily has her piano recital today, and you know how important this is for her Juilliard application. Go ask Rosario to make you breakfast." Emily. Always Emily. In that moment, standing in my mother's doorway in my faded nightgown while she fussed over my sister's future, I felt the full weight of what I'd been given settle onto my small shoulders. This wasn't a gift, this was a test. And I was going to pass it by doing the one thing I'd never managed in my first life. I was going to save myself. The next 19 years of my first life had followed a predictable pattern of neglect and cruelty that I'd been too young and desperate for love to recognize as abuse. My parents, Margaret and Richard Chen, yes, Dr. Chen was my father, a detail that made his abandonment at the hospital even more grotesque, had married young and had me by accident. I was the child who'd interrupted my mother's career as a concert pianist and my father's meteoric rise through Stanford Medical School. They'd resented me from the start. Then Emily was born 5 years later, planned and wanted, and I became obsolete. Emily had gotten the piano lessons, the private tutors, the SAT prep courses that cost more than my entire year's allowance. Emily had gotten new clothes while I wore hand-me-downs from cousins. Emily had gotten the down payment for her first car at 16 while I worked double shifts at a coffee shop to afford the bus pass for community college. Every family photo was carefully composed to showcase her, my parents flanking her like proud sentinels, while I was cropped to a sliver on the edge or missing entirely. But the cruelty went deeper than mere favoritism. When I was 12, I'd saved up for 6 months to buy myself a nice dress for the 8th grade dance. The first school event I'd ever been excited about. The morning of the dance, I found the dress in shreds on my bedroom floor. Emily, 7 years old and already vicious, had taken scissors to it because it was prettier than her Easter dress, and she couldn't stand it. When I'd shown my mother the ruins, sobbing, she'd slapped me across the face. "Stop being dramatic," she'd hissed. "You probably cut it yourself for attention. Emily would never do something so cruel." I'd gone to school that day with a handprint on my cheek and missed the dance entirely, locked in my room as punishment for lying. When I was 15, I'd won a scholarship to a prestigious summer writing program at Berkeley. Full ride, all expenses paid, the opportunity of a lifetime. My English teacher had called it a transformative experience that could change my future. My father had made me decline it because Emily needed someone to watch her during the day while they worked, and hiring a babysitter was an unnecessary expense when Claire is just going to waste time writing silly stories anyway. I'd spent that summer making grilled cheese sandwiches and playing servant to a 10-year-old who called me the help, and meant it. When I was 19, I'd been accepted to UC Berkeley on a partial scholarship. I needed $12,000 for the remaining tuition and living expenses, money I'd been carefully saving from my coffee shop wages since I was 16. The night before the deposit was due, I'd found my bank account emptied. My father had drained it to pay for Emily's spring break trip to Paris with her private school friends. "Family helps family," he'd said, not even looking up from his medical journal when I'd confronted him, shaking with rage and despair. "Emily needs exposure to culture for her college applications. You can take classes at the community college. It's closer to home anyway." I'd never gotten that money back. I'd never gone to Berkeley. I'd spent the next 7 years taking classes part-time while working full-time to pay for them, watching my dreams calcify into bitterness while Emily glided through Juilliard on my stolen future. But the heart condition, that was the piece that haunted me most in those first weeks of my rebirth. I'd started having symptoms at 20. Shortness of breath, chest pains, dizzy spells that would leave me gripping the counter at work. I'd gone to my father, terrified, and he'd laughed. Actually laughed. "You're experiencing anxiety," he'd said dismissively. "Probably because you're jealous of Emily's success. I'll prescribe you some Xanax and you need to start exercising more, lose some weight." I wasn't overweight. I was exhausted and sick, and my own father, a cardiologist, had dismissed me without a single test. For 6 years, I'd begged for help. The symptoms got worse. I'd black out climbing stairs, wake up with my heart racing so fast I thought it would explode from my chest. My mother told me to stop being dramatic. Emily told me I was faking for attention. My father threatened to have me psychologically evaluated if I didn't stop these hysterics. By the time I'd finally collapsed at my office job and a non-family doctor had run tests, my mitral valve was so damaged that surgery was the only option. The condition was congenital, genetic, something I'd been born with, something that would have been easily manageable if caught early, if my father had done his job, if anyone had cared enough to take me seriously. Instead, they'd let me deteriorate until I was dying. And on the night of my surgery, the night that should have been routine but became complicated because of how advanced the damage was, they'd all chosen champagne and canapes over sitting in a waiting room. They'd chosen a party over the possibility that I might not wake up. I did wake up, just long enough to die alone in the dark. Now, at 7 years old, with all those memories crystalline and terrible in my mind, I lay in my childhood bed and made a plan. I had 19 years to prepare for a future that wouldn't happen. 19 years to build a life they couldn't touch, couldn't steal, couldn't destroy. But I also had to be smart. I was 7 years old in body, financially dependent, legally powerless. If I revealed what I knew or acted too drastically, they'd institutionalize me or simply tighten their control. So I became a ghost in my own house. I stopped asking for love or attention. When my mother forgot my parent-teacher conferences, I forged her signature. When Emily destroyed my homework out of spite, I redid it without complaint. When my father missed my elementary school graduation for Emily's piano recital, I didn't cry. I documented. I started keeping a journal carefully hidden in a loose floorboard under my bed. Every instance of neglect, every cruel comment, every time they chose Emily over my basic needs, I wrote it down with dates, times, witnesses when available. 7-year-old handwriting describing abuse in the clinical, precise language I'd learned from years of therapy in my first life. It would be my insurance policy. But documentation wasn't enough. I needed resources. My father had a home office where he kept his medical files, his financial records, his passwords scribbled on Post-it notes because he was brilliant but arrogant enough to think himself invulnerable. I was small and quiet and utterly beneath his notice. Over the course of several months, I photographed everything, bank statements showing the $12,000 he'd stolen from me, except in this timeline it hadn't happened yet, and I'd make sure it never would. Tax returns revealing a secret account my mother didn't know about, emails to my father's lawyer about how to minimize child support in the event of a future divorce. They were planning to throw me away. They just hadn't done it yet. I also began researching my heart condition with a focus that would have seemed disturbing in a child if anyone had been paying attention. No one was. I read everything I could find online about mitral valve prolapse, congenital defects, early intervention. I learned the symptoms I should watch for, the tests I needed, the specialists who could help. I memorized the name of every pediatric cardiologist in the Bay Area who wasn't my father. And I found Dr. Sarah Martinez, a brilliant cardiologist at UCSF with a reputation for taking pediatric cases other doctors missed, especially in low-income families. She ran a sliding scale clinic one Saturday a month. When I was 8, I took the bus alone, a terrifying journey I'd mapped out obsessively, to her clinic with my saved allowance and a list of symptoms written in my neatest handwriting. Dr. Martinez had kind eyes and didn't dismiss me when I said my father was a doctor who didn't believe I was sick. She ran an EKG, an echocardiogram, blood work. When the results came back, her face had gone pale. "Claire," she'd said gently, crouching to my eye level, "you have a congenital mitral valve issue. It's not severe yet, but without monitoring and eventually surgery, it will be. Why didn't your father catch this?" "He thinks I'm lying," I'd said simply. "He only cares about my sister." The look on her face, rage mixed with heartbreak, had validated every terrible memory I carried. She'd given me her personal cell phone number and made me promise to call her immediately if symptoms worsened. She'd also filed a report with CPS, though nothing came of it. My father was too well connected, my mother too socially prominent. The social worker had bought their story about me being troubled and seeking attention. But I had documentation. I had a real doctor who believed me, and I had time. The years passed in a strange duality. To my family, I was the quiet, forgettable daughter who caused no trouble and required no thought. I got myself to school, made my own meals when they forgot to feed me, and stayed out of Emily's way. They didn't notice when I started taking advanced classes, or when my teachers began pulling me aside to tell me I was gifted. They didn't notice when I tested into the gifted program or when I started high school 2 years early at 13. They noticed Emily's mediocre piano recitals and her average grades that they spun as excellence through sheer force of will and expensive tutors. While Emily struggled through pre-algebra with a private tutor that cost $200 an hour, I was teaching myself calculus from library books and scoring perfect marks on every standardized test. While Emily had tantrums about her allowance not being enough to buy designer handbags, I was working a weekend job at a bookstore and saving every penny in an account my father didn't know existed. One I'd opened at a different bank using a school ID. By the time I was 14 and should have been 16, I'd saved $8,000, taught myself to code, and built a small web design business that brought in another $1,000 a month. I worked on client projects late at night when everyone assumed I was sleeping. The money went into my secret account, building my escape fund, but I also cultivated something else: witnesses. Ms. Patricia Reeves, my high school guidance counselor, became the first adult besides Dr. Martinez who saw through my family's facade. I'd gone to her office regularly, ostensibly for college counseling, but really to build a relationship with someone who could corroborate my story later. I never outright told her about the abuse. I was too strategic for that, but I let things slip. How I'd never been to a doctor, except the one time I went alone. How I made my own lunch every day because there was no food at home. How my parents had never attended a single school event. Ms. Reeves kept notes. I knew she did because she was meticulous and she cared, and I'd counted on both qualities. I did the same with my AP English teacher, Mr. Kim, who noticed the faded clothes and the fact that I never joined after-school activities because I had to work. With the school nurse who'd treated me for untreated strep throat and a sprained ankle that had gone unwrapped for days. With my manager at the bookstore, a sharp-eyed woman named Denise, who'd once asked me point-blank if everything was okay at home and seemed unconvinced by my lies. I was building a case, witness by witness, document by document, dollar by dollar. The turning point came during my sophomore year of high school when I was 14. Emily, then 12 and in 7th grade, had been cast as the lead in her middle school's production of Annie. My parents were beside themselves with pride, as if she'd won a Tony. My mother took a week off work to help with costume fittings. My father rearranged his hospital schedule to attend every rehearsal. I had my own milestone that week. I'd been selected as one of 10 students nationwide to present research at the Intel Science and Engineering Fair. My project on predictive algorithms for heart failure had placed first at the regional level, and the nationals were in Washington, D.C. It was the kind of achievement that came with scholarship opportunities, media attention, and recruitment from top universities. I'd put the acceptance packet on the kitchen table with a sticky note. "Can you sign the permission form? I need it by Friday." Friday came and went. The permission form sat untouched, buried under junk mail and Emily's sheet music. My parents never even asked what it was for. On Sunday, I watched them pile into the car for Emily's opening night. My mother in a cocktail dress, my father with a bouquet of roses, and felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just cold, crystalline clarity. That night, alone in the house, I called Ms. Reeves at her home number, which she'd given me for emergencies. "I need help," I'd said quietly, "and I need to know if you're willing to testify that my parents have been neglecting me if it comes to that." There was a long pause, then, "Tell me everything." I told her about the missed permission form, about the heart condition they'd ignored, about the years of being treated as less than invisible, about Emily's party and my future death that no one in this timeline would ever believe. I told her I had documentation, journals, photographs, medical records. I told her I had a plan, but I needed an adult witness who couldn't be dismissed as a child's delusion. Ms. Reeves had asked to see my documentation. 2 days later, sitting in her office after school with the door locked, I'd shown her everything. The journals written in a child's hand describing years of calculated neglect, the photos of my father's financial records showing the money he'd stolen from future me, the medical files from Dr. Martinez. She'd cried, actually cried, this tough, no-nonsense woman who'd worked in public education for 20 years. "I'm calling a lawyer," she'd said. "A friend of mine handles family law. You need emancipation, and you need it now before they can do any more damage." "Not yet," I'd told her. "I'm only 14. The courts won't emancipate me without proof I can support myself, and I need more capital. But in 2 years, when I'm 16 and can legally work full-time, when I have enough saved, then we move. Until then, we document everything." She'd agreed reluctantly, but she'd also made me promise to come to her immediately if things got worse. Things didn't get worse. They simply continued in their predictable patterns. Emily's mediocrity being celebrated, my excellence being ignored. But now I had allies, and I had a timeline, the Intel Science Fair. Permission form had expired unsigned. I'd missed nationals, but I'd learned a valuable lesson. Waiting for them to care was a fool's game, so I'd stopped waiting. When I was 15, I'd applied early admission to MIT with a full portfolio of achievements they knew nothing about. The Intel Science Fair regional win they'd ignored, a published research paper on predictive cardiac algorithms in a peer-reviewed journal, my web design business, perfect SAT scores, and a personal essay about overcoming adversity that Ms. Reeves had helped me polish until it shone. I'd listed Ms. Reeves as my primary contact, not my parents. She'd written me a recommendation that she later told me had made the admissions officer cry. Mr. Kim and Dr. Martinez had written the others. I'd gotten my acceptance letter in February of my sophomore year, 16 years old, early admission to MIT with a full scholarship plus stipend, dorm room included, a future that was mine and mine alone. I didn't tell my parents. Instead, I'd walked into Ms. Reeves's office with the letter and my 2 years of continued documentation, now including report cards they'd never signed, medical appointments they'd never noticed, school events they'd never attended, and I'd said, "Now we do this now." The emancipation petition had been filed that week. My parents had been served papers on a Tuesday morning while I was at school. I'd arranged to stay with Ms. Reeves during the proceedings, having anticipated that home would become hostile. I'd anticipated correctly. My mother had shown up at school the next day screaming in the parking lot about how I was ungrateful and destroying the family and doing this for attention. Security had to escort her off campus. My father had sent a series of increasingly threatening emails about how I'd never survive on my own, and he'd make sure I regretted this. All of it documented, all of it submitted to the court. Emily had sent me a single text. "I hope you die alone." The hearing had taken 3 months. 3 months of living with Ms. Reeves and her wife in their quiet, book-filled home where people asked about my day and meant it, where dinner happened at a set time and everyone ate together, where I had my own room that no one entered without knocking. 3 months of therapy mandated by the court, where I'd finally, carefully revealed the full truth of my rebirth to a psychologist who'd listened with increasingly wat's eyes and then, blessedly said, whether this is memory, dream, or delusion doesn't change the fact that the abuse you've documented is real and severe. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Yu, had read every page of my documentation. She'd listened to testimonies from Ms. Reeves, Mr. Kim, Dr. Martinez, Denise from the bookstore, and 3 of my classmates who'd witnessed my mother's parking lot meltdown. She'd reviewed my financial records proving I could support myself, my MIT acceptance, my medicals, files showing years of untreated illness. Then she'd looked at my parents, my father in his expensive suit, my mother with her perfect hair and designer handbag, and said, I have presided over family court for 17 years, and rarely have I seen such a clear-cut case of willful neglect bordering on abuse. This child has been forced to raise herself while you poured all your resources into her sibling. You have failed in your most basic duty as parents. She'd granted the emancipation immediately. I'd walked out of that courtroom at 16 years old, legally an adult with a full scholarship to MIT and $23,000 in my private account. My parents had no legal claim to me anymore. They couldn't take my money, couldn't make my decisions, couldn't hurt me. I was free, but I wasn't done. That summer before MIT, I'd done 3 things. First, I'd legally changed my last name from Chen to my grandmother's maiden name. Not the grandmother who'd abandoned me to die in my first life, but my maternal grandmother who'd died when I was 3, before she could know what her daughter had become. I became Claire Rosewood, shedding their name like a snake shedding skin. Second, I'd filed a malpractice complaint against my father with the California Medical Board for failing to diagnose and treat my heart condition despite clear symptoms and his obligation as both a doctor and a parent. Dr. Martinez had provided expert testimony. The complaint had included my complete medical history and his dismissive emails. It would take years to process, but it would be a stain on his record forever. Third, I'd gotten the surgery I needed. Dr. Martinez had performed it herself at UCSF, repairing my valve before the damage became irreversible. I'd recovered in a hospital room with Ms. Reeves holding my hand and flowers from my teachers and co-workers surrounding my bed. No family, no Emily, no parents who'd chosen a party over my life. And I'd survived. MIT was everything I'd dreamed it would be. Challenging, exhilarating, full of people who valued intelligence and ambition. I'd double majored in computer science and biomedical engineering, maintaining a 4.0 while continuing to build my web design business into something more substantial, a health tech startup focused on early detection algorithms for cardiac conditions. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was building technology to prevent what had happened to me from happening to others. By the time I was 20, 4 years ahead of where I'd been in my first life, my company, Rosewood Diagnostics, had secured Series A funding of $12 million. We'd developed an AI-powered app that could detect cardiac irregularities from smartphone sensors with 89% accuracy. Hospitals were beginning to pilot our technology. Forbes had named me in their 30 under 30 list. I was successful, wealthy, and genuinely happy in a way I'd never been in my first life. I had friends who chose me first, romantic interests who valued me, mentors who saw my potential. I'd built a life that was wholly mine, but I still carried my memories like scars, and I knew the graduation party was coming. In my first life, Emily had graduated from Juilliard when she was 22 and I was 26. In this timeline, she'd still be graduating, older than me now by only 2 years of real time, though I was mentally 33. I was 20, she was 22, and according to the LinkedIn profile I hate followed, she was indeed graduating this spring from San Francisco Conservatory of Music, not Juilliard. Apparently, without the stolen $12,000, her college options had been more limited. Without my unwilling support, Emily's life had gone differently too. I wondered if they'd noticed the correlation. Probably not. People like my parents never connected their cruelty to consequences. I hadn't spoken to any of them in 4 years. No calls, no emails, no chance encounters carefully avoided. Ms. Reeves occasionally updated me. My father's malpractice complaint had resulted in a formal censure and mandatory ethics training, a humiliation he'd never recovered from professionally. My mother had apparently had a breakdown after I left, though Ms. Reeves suspected it was really rage at losing control. Emily had struggled in college without someone to blame for her problems. I hadn't cared enough to feel satisfaction. I'd simply moved on. But then, 3 weeks before Emily's graduation, I'd gotten an email from my mother. Subject line: family emergency. I'd stared at it for a long moment, my finger hovering over delete. Then curiosity, or maybe the part of me that still remembered dying alone, had won. I'd opened it. Claire, I know we haven't spoken in years, and I know you think we're terrible people, but I'm asking you, as your mother, to please come to Emily's graduation party. She's your sister. This is a family milestone. Whatever happened in the past, family should be there for these moments. Your father and I have done a lot of thinking since you left. We made mistakes. We weren't perfect parents, but we want to try to repair our relationship. Please give us this chance. The party is on June 15th at the Fairmont Hotel. We'd really like you to be there. Mom. I'd read it twice, looking for the trap. The manipulation was obvious. The guilt tripping, the minimization of weren't perfect parents, the complete lack of actual apology or acknowledgement. But what struck me was the date. June 15th. In my first life, Emily's graduation party had been on June 15th. The same night I died in the hospital, alone and forgotten. It wasn't the same hospital visit in this timeline. I'd already had my surgery, I was healthy. But the audacity of them reaching out now specifically for this event felt like the universe offering me a choice. I could ignore it, continue my life, let them fade into irrelevance. That would be the healthy choice, the one my therapist would recommend. Or I could show them exactly who I'd become in their absence. I'd replied simply, I'll think about it. Then I'd made some phone calls. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in strategic planning. I'd learned in my first life that revenge wasn't about confrontation. It was about revealing truth in a way that couldn't be ignored or explained away. It was about poetic justice. First, I'd contacted Ms. Reeves, who'd retired from teaching but remained a close friend. I need you to attend a party with me as my guest, I'd said. And I need you to bring your documentation. She'd understood immediately. It's time? It's time. Second, I'd reached out to Dr. Martinez, who'd become not just my doctor, but a mentor and friend. I'm going to see my family for the first time in 4 years, I told her. I'd like you there as witness to who I am now versus who they tried to keep me as. She'd agreed without hesitation. Third, I'd hired a video production company, one of my web design clients who owed me a favor, to document the evening. Not secretly, that would be illegal, but openly, as if I were creating a family memory video. I'd told my mother I wanted to capture the moment of our reunion, and she'd been so eager for the optics of reconciliation that she'd agreed immediately. Fourth, and most importantly, I'd prepared a gift, a very specific gift. Emily's graduation party was being held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel, paid for by my parents, at what I knew from my own event planning experience was about $50,000. Champagne, catered dinner, a live quartet, 200 guests including all their society friends and my father's medical colleagues. It was exactly the kind of ostentatious display they loved. I'd arrived 30 minutes after the party started, deliberately late, wearing a custom gown that had cost more than my mother's monthly salary, and driving a Tesla that my startup's success had paid for in cash. Dr. Martinez and Ms. Reeves accompanied me, both dressed elegantly, both wearing small, knowing smiles. The video crew followed us inside. My entrance caused a visible ripple through the room. Conversations stopped, heads turned. I'd last seen most of these people when I was 16, emancipated and troubled. Now I was 20, successful and undeniably thriving. My mother spotted me first, and the expression that crossed her face was complex: shock, confusion, and something that might have been resentment before she schooled it into a smile. "Claire," she'd said, moving toward me with her arms outstretched as if to hug me. "You came. You look... well." I'd stepped back, just far enough to make the rejection clear. "Margaret, Richard." I'd nodded to my father, who'd appeared at my mother's elbow. Thank you for the invitation. The use of their first names had been deliberate. They weren't my parents anymore. They were strangers who'd given birth to me. Let me introduce you to my guests, I'd continued smoothly, but Carlos, this is Dr. Sarah Martinez from UCSF, the cardiologist who actually diagnosed and treated my heart condition, and Ms. Patricia Reeves, my former guidance counselor who helped me gain emancipation. I thought it was appropriate to bring the people who actually raised me to this family celebration. The color had drained from my father's face. Around us, guests had gone silent, listening. Claire, this isn't the time, Kees, my mother had started. No, I think it's exactly the time, I'd said pleasantly. After all, Emily's graduation is such an important milestone. Family should be here for these moments. That's what you said in your email, right? Emily herself had appeared then, resplendent in an emerald dress that probably cost what I used to make in a month at the bookstore. She'd frozen when she saw me, her expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and then pure hatred. What are you doing here? She'd hissed. I'm here to celebrate you, I'd said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. And to give you a graduation gift. I'd handed her an envelope, crisp, cream-colored, expensive. The kind of envelope that held important documents. Emily had opened it with her perfectly manicured nails, pulled out the contents, and gone white. It was a check. For $12,000, the exact amount my father had stolen from me in my first life, adjusted for inflation and interest, made out to the San Francisco Youth Orchestra's scholarship fund in Emily's name. I've established a scholarship, I'd announced, loud enough for the room to hear. The Emily Chen Memorial Fund for Underprivileged Music Students. $12,000 annually, in perpetuity, to support talented young musicians who can't afford private lessons or instruments. I thought it was fitting, given Emily's privilege and opportunities, that she give back to those who weren't as fortunate. The room had erupted in polite applause. How could they not? It looked generous, philanthropic, kind. Emily had looked like she might vomit. She understood what I'd really done, immortalized her as a symbol of privilege, used her name to highlight the very advantages that had come at my expense. Every year, some scholarship recipient would be praised for overcoming odds Emily never had to face. Every year, she'd be reminded that her success had been purchased with stolen resources. That's not all, I'd continued. I also have something for you, Margaret and Richard. I'd produced another envelope, this one thicker. Inside were copies of documents, every piece of evidence from my emancipation case, now bound in a professional packet with a cover page that read, The Case of Claire Chen, a Study in Parental Neglect. I've donated this to Stanford's Medical Ethics Department and the California Medical Board, I'd said conversationally. It's being used as a teaching tool for recognizing signs of child neglect, particularly in affluent families where the abuse is subtle. My father's failure to diagnose my heart condition despite his specialty is a featured case study. I thought you'd want copies for your records. My father had made a strangled sound. Several of his colleagues in the room had leaned in, suddenly very interested. I've also included some financials, I'd continued. Documentation of college funds that were diverted, bank accounts that were emptied without consent. You know, the kind of thing that might interest, say, a forensic accountant. Or the IRS, since I don't believe that $12,000 was ever reported as a gift, which would have tax implications. My mother had grabbed my arm then, her nails digging in. What do you want? She'd whispered furiously. Money? Is this blackmail? I'd looked down at her hand on my arm, then directly into her eyes. I don't want anything from you. I stopped wanting anything from you the day I died alone in a hospital room while you drank champagne and celebrated the daughter you actually loved. Oh wait, that hasn't happened in this timeline, has it? I'd pulled my arm free. I'm here because you invited me to a family milestone and said family should be present for these moments. So I'm present, and I'm showing you what family actually means. I gestured to Ms. Reeves and Dr. Martinez. These women showed up for me when I was sick, when I was scared, when I needed someone to believe in me. They're my family now. You're just people who share my DNA. The video crew had captured everything. Every word, every expression, every moment of my parents' carefully constructed facade cracking. Emily had started crying then, ugly sobs that ruined her makeup. "You're ruining my night," she'd wailed. "This is my party, my graduation. Why do you always have to make everything about you?" The irony was so staggering, I'd actually laughed. "Your party," I'd repeated. "Yes, Emily, it's always your party, isn't it? Your recital, your graduation, your life that mattered while I was dying in the background. Do you know why I'm really here?" I'd pulled out my phone, called up a photo, and held it up for the room to see. It was the Instagram post from my first life, Emily's graduation party, my family's smiling faces, the timestamp showing 9:47 p.m. on June 15th. In another photo on my phone, I'd doctored in a screenshot of medical records showing the time of my death, 9:52 p.m. In another life, I'd said quietly, I died alone in a hospital on this exact night, at almost this exact time, while you all celebrated here without me. My heart gave out because my father ignored my symptoms for 6 years, and my mother told me I was being dramatic. No one visited, no one called, no one cared. The room was absolutely silent now. That life ended, and I got a second chance. So I used it to build something you couldn't touch. I got healthy, got educated, got successful, and I did it all without you. And now I'm here, on the night you chose champagne over my life, to show you exactly what you lost when you decided I wasn't worth loving. Ida turned to Emily. "You wished I would die alone. I did, but I came back and I made sure that this time you're the one who ends up with nothing." "That's insane," my father had blustered, trying to regain control. "You're having delusions." "Am I?" I'd looked around the room. Everyone here can verify the medical neglect is documented at Sierra Condes. The financial theft is documented. The emancipation was granted by a judge who reviewed years of evidence. Whether I have memories of another timeline or not doesn't change the reality of what you did in this one. I'd handed my mother the business card for my therapist. "You might want to book an appointment. I hear parental alienation is tough to process, especially when you're entirely at fault." Then I'd turned to address the room at large, where 200 of San Francisco's elite society members stood watching our family implode in real time. "I apologize for disrupting the celebration," I'd said with perfect composure. "I know you're all here to honor Emily's graduation from the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. That's a legitimate achievement, and I don't want to diminish it. But I also think it's important to note that achievements mean more when they're earned through personal merit rather than purchased through another person's suffering." I'd smiled, bright and cold. "Please enjoy your champagne. Toast to Emily's future. I hope it brings her everything she deserves." The weight of that last sentence, "everything she deserves," had hung in the air like a curse. I'd walked out then, Ms. Reeves and Dr. Martinez flanking me like bodyguards, the video crew capturing our exit. Behind us, the party had dissolved into chaos, shouting, crying, guests whispering furiously. I'd heard my mother screaming my name, my father trying to do damage control with his colleagues, Emily's sobs echoing off the ballroom's high ceilings. We'd gotten into my Tesla and driven away, and I'd felt lighter than I had in 2 lifetimes. The video had gone viral within 48 hours, not because I'd released it, though I had every legal right to, since all parties had been informed of the recording, but because one of the guests, a journalist friend of a friend, had written an article for Medium titled "The Hidden Cost of Achievement, One Family's Reckoning." It had been shared 50,000 times in the first day. The article had detailed everything I'd said at the party, corroborated by the public records of my emancipation case. It had included quotes from Dr. Martinez about medical neglect in affluent families. It had featured excerpts from Ms. Reeves about educational inequity and how schools fail to notice struggling children in wealthy households. Most importantly, it had positioned me not as bitter or vindictive, but as a survivor who'd had the courage to confront her abusers publicly and demand accountability. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict swiftly. I was the hero of my own story, and my family were the villains. Stanford Medical School had launched an investigation into my father's treatment of me, expanding their review of the malpractice complaint. Several of his patients had come forward with their own stories of dismissive care. Within a month, he'd been quietly forced to resign from his position at Stanford Hospital, though he retained his license. My mother had been asked to step down from her position on the board of the San Francisco Symphony after several members had cited concerns about her character and judgment. Her social standing, the thing she'd valued above everything, including her own children, had evaporated overnight. Emily had faced her own consequences. The conservatory had launched a quiet inquiry into whether my parents' donations had influenced her admissions and grades. Nothing had been proven, but the whispers had followed her. She'd gotten a position with a small regional orchestra in Sacramento, far from the prestigious placements she'd expected. Her social media had been flooded with comments questioning whether she'd earned anything in her life or simply coasted on my stolen resources. I'd watched it all unfold from the distance of my new life in Boston, where I'd relocated after MIT to be near my company's headquarters. I'd been genuinely happy, dating a kind, brilliant software engineer I'd met at a tech conference, building my company toward an IPO, living in a beautiful brownstone with Ms. Reeves in a guest room because she'd retired and decided Boston was a nice change from California. I'd built a family of choice, surrounded by people who celebrated my successes and supported my struggles. I'd had game nights with friends, Sunday brunches with my girlfriend, therapy sessions where I processed my trauma with professional help. I'd had a life worth living, but the story wasn't quite finished yet. Exactly 1 year after the party, I'd received an email from Emily. Subject line, please. Claire, I know I don't deserve your time or attention. I know I was horrible to you growing up. I know I participated in your abuse through my silence, if not my actions. I'm not writing to ask forgiveness because I don't think I can be forgiven. I'm writing because I've been in therapy for the past year and my therapist suggested I write to you not for closure, but for honesty. So here's the truth. I always knew Mom and Dad treated you differently. Even as a little kid, I knew you got less and I got more. And I liked it. I liked being the favorite. I liked being special. And when you tried to succeed despite them, I felt threatened, so I participated in tearing you down. I destroyed your dress when we were kids because you looked prettier than me and I couldn't stand it. I encouraged Mom to make you stay home that summer because I was jealous you'd been chosen for the writing program. I told Dad you were faking your heart symptoms because I thought you were being dramatic and stealing attention from me. I'm not saying this for sympathy. I'm saying it because you deserve to hear someone in our family admit that what happened to you was wrong, that it was our fault, and that you didn't deserve any of it. I can't change the past. I can't give you back the childhood or the family you should have had. I can't even honestly say I'm a good person now. I'm trying to be better, but I'm still selfish and shallow and struggling with the fact that everything I built was built on your suffering. But I can say this, you were right about all of it, and I'm sorry. Genuinely, deeply sorry in a way that words can't convey. I don't expect a response. I just needed you to know. Emily. I'd read the email 3 times, looking for manipulation or lies. I'd found only exhaustion and what seemed like genuine remorse. I'd sat with it for a week, discussing it with my therapist, with Miss Reeves, with my girlfriend. They'd all said the same thing. Whatever I chose, forgiveness, indifference, continued estrangement, was valid. In the end, I'd replied, Emily, thank you for your honesty. It's more than I ever expected from you. I accept your apology in the sense that I acknowledge you've offered it, and I believe you mean it, but I don't forgive you, and I don't think I ever will. What you all did to me can't be forgiven with words. It changed who I am at a fundamental level. I died because of your family's neglect in one timeline. In this one, I survived, but only because I fought like hell to save myself while you all actively tried to destroy me. That's not something that gets resolved with therapy and an email. But I do appreciate that you're trying to be better. Not for my sake, we'll never have a relationship, but for your own. Everyone deserves the chance to grow beyond their worst selves. I hope you build a life you're proud of. I hope you earn your successes through your own merit. I hope you find people who love you for who you are, not what they can take from you. But we're done. Don't contact me again. Claire. That had been 9 months ago. Emily hadn't contacted me since. Neither had my parents, though I'd heard through Ms. Reeves's network that they'd separated. My mother had filed for divorce after discovering the secret bank account, the one I'd photographed all those years ago. They were fighting over assets with the kind of viciousness they'd once directed at me. I'd felt nothing when I heard. They'd become irrelevant to my life, minor characters in a story where I was finally the protagonist. Now, at 21 years old, I was preparing for Rosewood Diagnostics to go public. We'd expanded our cardiac monitoring app to include stroke prediction and diabetes detection. We had partnerships with 3 major hospital systems, our Series T. B funding had valued us at $200 million. Forbes had called me a visionary. TechCrunch had compared me to Elizabeth Holmes, but actually legit. MIT had asked me to give their commencement speech next year. I had a life beyond my wildest dreams from either timeline. Success, love, purpose, peace. I'd taken the worst hand I'd ever been dealt and turned it into something beautiful. But more than that, I'd survived. I'd thrived. I'd proven that they were wrong about me, that I wasn't worthless, wasn't dramatic, wasn't the problem child they'd needed me to be to justify their cruelty. I'd proven that the only thing holding me back had been them, and without them, I was extraordinary. On a rainy Tuesday evening in November, I sat in my brownstone with Ms. Reeves, Dr. Martinez, who'd flown out to visit, and my girlfriend Jessica, celebrating the final FDA approval for our app. We had champagne. Good champagne, the kind you drink when you've actually earned the celebration. To Claire, Ms. Reeves had raised her glass, tears in her eyes. Who taught me that sometimes the best thing you can do for a child is believe them and help them save themselves? To Claire, Dr. Martinez had echoed. Who turned her trauma into technology that will save thousands of lives? To Claire, Jessica had said softly, squeezing my hand. Who survived death itself and came back stronger? I'd looked around at these women, my real family, my chosen family, and felt something that had been absent in both my lives until now: belonging. To second chances, I'd said, raising my glass, and to never going home. We'd clinked glasses as rain pattered against the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth. Somewhere in California, my birth family was dealing with the consequences of their choices. Here in Boston, I was building a future they'd never be part of. I'd been given a rare gift, the chance to live my life twice, to correct course, to save myself before it was too late. Not everyone got that opportunity. Most people only got one shot, and they had to make the best of it without foreknowledge or second chances. But I'd taken my second chance and turned it into something more than just survival. I'd turned it into victory, complete, total, and so thoroughly earned that no one could take it from me. In my first life, I'd died alone in a hospital room on the night of Emily's graduation party, 26 years old and unloved. In this life, I was 21 years old, surrounded by people who chose me first, running a company that would change healthcare, and I had never been more alive. They'd chosen her graduation party over my hospital discharge. After Rebirth, I'd chosen everything they said I could never have: success, love, family, purpose, and I'd built it all without them. And that was the best revenge of all, not destruction, but transcendence. Not dragging them down, but rising so far above them that they disappeared from view entirely. I took a sip of champagne and smiled. I'd finally come home. Not to the house where I'd suffered, but to the life I'd built, the family I'd chosen, and the future I'd earned, and it was perfect.